I've got a lot to get off my chest with Charlie Olives v Justin Gaethje. Now, of all the fights that I've seen in the last year, I probably haven't seen a matchup as close in terms of verdicts and polls and breakdowns and stats and my followers with this one. This really can swing either way, and there's so many possibilities of this fight outcome. And before we jump into that, I want to just remind everyone that Justin Gaethje can barely breathe and Charlie Olives can barely see. So the fact that they are the upper echelon of one of the most difficult divisions in all of combat sports is quite incredible. And that goes to show for each of them the innate fighters that they are and the things that they're willing to push through. And we'll come on to that in a second. But let's have a look at the actual stylistic breakdown, because they say styles makes fights. They are not wrong. If we look at Justin Gaethje, I'm going to put this on paper and just say it. The best Justin Gaethje, Charlie Olives, the best offensive submission grappler of all time. The stats are there to back that up. And then we have a look at Justin Gaethje, one of the most exciting, violent men in all of UFC history, but especially the lightweight division. And he's got the stats to back them up. He has a 110% chance of getting a performance of the night or a fight of the night bonus. 110% chance. Think about that statistic. That's outrageous. But I'm going to bring you on to another outrageous statistic with Charlie Olives. In his first 18 fights, he saw 10-8 on his record. Now, that alone is a decent stint in the organisation, and you've done well to make it 18 fights first and foremost, but also get 10 wins in the UFC. It's actually very impressive and not easy to do. But in his most recent 10 fights, he is 10-0. So Charlie Olives coming into this has the utmost amount of confidence, and rightly so. And what we have to remember is before he was fighting at 45, definitely not his weight class, a weight that he was having to cut down to, where he was depleting his body, where he was probably spending all of fight camp not sharpening his skills, but trying to make the weight. He's quite big for the weight class at lightweight anyway, so trying to make featherweight, that's crazy. But now his body's almost replenished. So we look back to the times that he's quote unquote quit. Was it him mentally quitting, or was it his body physically giving up? Because I beg to differ that it's probably the latter. So we have that confidence coming into it. And then we have Justin Gaethje, as I mentioned, one of the hardest hitting lightweights we've ever seen, who's also got an incredible record. Yes, he's had his downfalls, but he's coming into this with the idea and the belief that he can knock anyone out, which is very true, and we've seen it happen. So how does this actually play out? Because like I said, I see so many scenarios how this fight plays out. Everything's on the cards. Barring a Justin Gaethje submission, I think us seeing Gaethje knock out Charlie Olives, us seeing Charlie Olives submit him or not Justin Gaethje out, they're all possibilities. We have a look at Charles Oliveira. We know that his strengths are going to be in his offensive grappling, so he's always going to want to close the distance, which gives him a lot of freedom with his strikes. He's then able to afford to throw something a little bit more outlandish or a little bit more out there, because the threat of takedown is non-existent, because there is no one on this earth that wants to play in Charlie Olives' guard. So he knows he has that ability. And this is what makes him so well-rounded. And when we look at pound-for-pound lists, this is why I think he needs to start entering the conversation, because he is a threat at every range. Like I said, very long for the weight class, and he fights very long as well. He fights behind, kicks up the middle, teeps, long jabs, long straight shots. Really nice boxing. And his striking's gone a little bit underrated, but we have a look at his Muay Thai. It's exceptional. His Muay Thai clinch is so strong, so when he does have you in that tight vicinity, he's either going to probably slip some underhooks and try and get his chest to your back, or he's going to keep that clinch and fire knees up there. The dexterity in his hips is crazy, or he's got really nice elbows, so he can do damage in that clinch. And we know that even though Justin Gaethje has a reasonable reach for the weight class at 70 inches, a 4-inch deficit on Charlie Olives, may I add, we know that he's got to close that distance, and also he fights very short. You see his stance and where he holds his hand and where he throws his shots from. He's very bounding close. That distance going to have to be close. So that's going to be the struggle here for Justin Gaethje. He needs to make sure that he's never backed up against the fence, Because when we think of Charlie Olives and his submission abilities, he doesn't need to shoot that takedown. Now, even though I think he's got incredible wrestling, we know obviously the credentials of Justin Gaethje, and whilst he may not be the most offensive wrestler, well, he's actually never shot for a takedown in the UFC, so that goes to show. But it's his defensive wrestling which got him to being an NCAA champ, and which has got him to being allowed to stand on his feet for most of the fights, if not all of the fights he's ever been in. But Charlie Olives doesn't need that. He just needs to back you up into a cage, back you up into a corner, make things uncomfortable, maybe tag you with a knee, find an angle of you against the fence, and then he can get to work. And then he can just slide up your back or work you against the cage. So he doesn't need that conventional double leg. Justin Gaethje knows that. Justin Gaethje knows that he can't be on the fence at any point in this fight. He stands a little bit more square on, so that gives him the ability to square him up a little bit more. And this is where Justin Gaethje is dangerous, because we have seen Charles Oliveira take a shot in the early rounds of the fights many, many times. Now, yes, he has this confidence going into it. Yes, he has this ability to take a shot and move forward. But the risk to reward is not very good there for Charles Oliveira. I don't think he needs to enter that conversation. But this is where I find his ego may potentially get in the way. Now, I'm struggling to bet against Charles Oliveira. The 10-fight win streak of what I've known of him recently, it's a really hard fighter to bet against, especially where I think he can knock Justin Gaethje out, because we've seen him hurt and wobbled many times, and he is very hittable. He does leave his head on centre line, and we know that Charles has that power. But does his ego take over? Because that's what Justin Gaethje does to you. He fights your ego. He tells you, I'm getting you into a fight and I'm coming out winning. And that's something which doesn't go down with a lot of fighters. It takes someone very ego removed to beat someone like that, because that isn't always, like I said, the best risk to reward way of winning that fight for Charles Oliveira. So if he does get caught up in that brawl, if he does get caught in that clinch exchanging shots, yes, I think he may be able to hurt Gaethje, but that's where he lures you in. That's where you think, okay, I can then finish the fight. And with this confidence of this 10-0 win streak and what he's done to people when he has hurt them, Dustin Poirier, Michael Chandler of recent, he's going to think, this is no different. I'm going to finish him here. And that's where people get caught out with Justin Gaethje. And that's when he can potentially maybe rush a little bit, or maybe not step back and bide his time, think he's got him more hurt than he is. And then he leads himself onto an uppercut, or he leads himself onto a big unconventional right hand for Justin Gaethje, which then knocks him down and he can then finish. And then his own abilities are a lot more taken out the gas tank, because yes, Charles has great conditioning, but his technique does get a little bit sloppier the more tired we see him. However, when you look at Justin Gaethje, he's sloppy all the time and very unconventional all the time, and he really does carry that fight late. So the question is, does Charles Oliveira do what he needs to do to win? Because if he does, he'll do what I said. He'll stay long. He'll take his moments in the clinch, but he won't spend too much time there. He'll try and work him against the fence, close the distance, of course, get his hands wrapped around him, and try and just fight to his back, not even need a takedown. But Justin Gaethje is going to make this one thing. That is a dogfight. And I don't think the leg kicks or the low kicks are going to play as much of a factor with a lot of other fighters that it has with Justin Gaethje, just because of that Muay Thai stance that Charles Oliveira likes to use. He likes to use that very light front leg, and I'm not sure that'll be as much of a factor. But you know what it is with the human highlight. He has such dexterity in those hips. He can find those calves from absolutely anywhere, and he ends it onto the end of his combination. So that's always there. That's always there. So I'm really torn on this, and I didn't really want to bet on this at all. I only sprinkled a little bit of money on Justin Gaethje just because I felt there was a little bit of value there at 2.5, I think it was, to 1. So I chucked him in a little accumulator. But other than this, I'm really struggling to bet against Charles. I think that maybe he has seen it all now, and that ego won't be there, and he will do what he needs to win. And even if he does take a shot, he's going to think, this guy hits pretty hard, I'm not going to take another one of those. Closes the distance after a little bit of a back and forth in the first two, and gets a submission in the third, because we've seen the deficit in Justin Gaethje's offensive grappling at times. So my safe bet's going to go a Charles Oliveira 3rd round submission. I don't think this is going to go the distance. My other devil on my shoulder is telling me Justin Gaethje is going to knock him out. I think we're seeing a different mindset from Justin Gaethje that we've seen into his fights. I think we have to consider that he's now changed a lot in his lifestyle in regards to his diet and his nutrition. I heard him speak about before what he was eating and how he was fueling himself, and to think he got to that level and that fitness with that, I think this conditioning is going to be a different level. I think when he talks about bringing that dog back out in Justin Gaethje, we can sit here argue all day whether we think that's right or wrong, or if we think he depleted his body at 45 or he didn't, and now he's better at 55 and he doesn't have that quit and he's shown over and over. But there's one man that doesn't believe that. That's Justin Gaethje, and that's the most important man to believe that. And I truly believe that Justin Gaethje's sitting there at home at the minute thinking, I'm going to get him into a firefight strategically, because we've seen that reinvigorated version of Justin Gaethje, honing what's innately his, that wild, chaotic chaos, but Trevor Whitman style. So putting some footwork behind that, putting some traps behind that, putting some method behind the madness. And we're seeing this much more refined version. I went back and watched that Michael Chandler fight yesterday because I was intrigued what he said in an interview. He said, I barely got hit. I don't know why people kept saying it was a war, because it wasn't. He hit me like 4 times. I thought, he's crazy. That was a back and forth war of attrition. I go back and watch it. He is not wrong. He barely gets touched in that fight. Now, yes, he gets stung hard in the first round. I think Michael Chandler landed about 4 clean shots, which one of them did nearly put him out. But when do we not see that with Justin Gaethje? That was not untoward to any other fight he's ever had. So there was no red flag there. Then I watched the second and the third. Barely anything gets through. Barely anything lands. Not a lot was actually getting through to him. A lot was coming off the elbows. So I don't think he's worn out from that mentally and physically from that fight. I think he's replenished, and I think he now knows he's at a point physically, mentally, and in terms of his whole round fighting game where he can beat Charles Oliveira, and he knows that this is his final push at the title. And just like Charles did, I think he can turn it around and push past what Justin Gaethje's always been at, that top of the division and obviously an interim champion, but in his mind he's never been a champion, and that's what he says. This is his final push, and with a man like Justin Gaethje, I think that's a deadlier man than ever. And when we look at what we already know of him, that's a seriously scary prospect. So don't count out that one. That's a way for me to sit on the fence. Anyway, I'm going Charlie Olive's 3rd round submission as a safe bet on my scorecards.